Okay.
There you go.
Cool. There we go. Now we can do it properly. So what kind of whiskey is that?
This is a Lafroig. Well, that was what was at the front of the cabinet.
Your everyday, your Wednesday night whiskey?
You know what? I haven't had a drink in ages, weeks, if not a month or longer. And I certainly haven't had a Scotch in several months, I would
Oh
think.
my God, so I'm driving you to drink. That's a good start.
You it's been one of those days.
And I was just like comparing whiskers. I mean, like I've just been
Yeah,
through a couple of
this
days.
was
So
a Christmas thing. Well, every Christmas I stop shaving for the 2 weeks or so that we have off, and
yeah.
then I shave it when I come back. But this year I took 3 weeks off, and then I decided not to shave. I was just lazy, and then people said, "Oh, that looks good," so I kept it.
There you go. There you
And
go.
it was itchy to begin with, but then it stopped being itchy, so now I don't even notice it.
Plus, it's just you've got an extra 10 minutes times 3 or 4 times a week, right? You don't have to shave.
Yeah, for
Saves the
sure.
whole- That's
Yeah.
like, what's that? That's about 300 hours, 200 hours a year or something. That's pretty good.
Yeah, it depends how long I live, I guess. But
Yeah, that's why I do it. I'm just way too lazy. Tomorrow I'll shave.
yeah, I'm
Cool.
lazy.
So life is good apart from being way too busy.
Yeah, well, we've had a few family things and so
Okay.
on.
Well, yeah,
So
you mentioned some of that. Yeah.
yeah,
So, yeah, well, that's
deal
right.
with
Getting
that.
older sucks, but as I say, it beats the alternative.
Yeah, well, I mean, we're getting old and our parents are getting
Well,
older.
one of us is. I mean, I don't know which one it is, not me.
I just turned 60. What was
Did
it,
you really? Oh my God,
a little over a
congratulations.
month ago.
Congratulations, buddy.
So
Yeah.
I made it that far.
What's the view like from there?
I don't recommend it.
All right. Well, we should probably talk science for
Yeah,
anyone who's listening in or turns off. So, yeah, this Diana stuff. How did you even get into this anyway? I know you played around with some stuff at 7T, right? After the paper came out.
that's right. So after the bioarchive paper came out,
Mhm.
I had our Siemens scientist here, Omer Oren, actually code up the sequence. It was a trivial modification of a cine cardiac sequence. Um, so it's pretty standard, actually, clinically. You just have to put the triggers in the right place to make it into an fMRI sequence. And we tried that on a couple of people. 10, 12, 14 runs of 10, 15 minutes each, following the exact same recipe that they used. And then I threw that all into MATLAB and tried to get something out of it, and I got nothing out of it.
So important technical questions on the triggering. This is a Siemens system. So on the triggering, is there any overhead on the trigger?
Well, that's a good question. There may be. So we've never measured it.
Okay.
There's nothing obvious to us, but I mean, if it was a few microseconds, like the Jasanoff paper suggests,
Yeah.
we wouldn't have noticed it anyways.
Gotcha.
And honestly, there's a delay, an arbitrary delay anyways, because we're using a 60 hertz visual stimulus in those experiments. And so 1 over 60 hertz is plus or minus 1 over 60 hertz is what you're going to be for your temporal resolution anyways.
Yeah. Okay. Gotcha. That was my next question of what stimulus. So this is what, 32 channel coil, 64 channel coil? Doesn't really matter.
So this is a 32 channel occipital coil. So it's 32 channels
Gotcha.
sitting over V1.
Right.
So we have a lot of SNR.
Yeah. And then the same line scan. So one stimulus every 50-ish repetition times with a 40
Exactly
millisecond
the same
TR.
paradigm they
Yeah,
use.
so,
Nothing changed.
Yeah. So the 5 millisecond TR for MR, and then 40 reps per image. So 200 milliseconds per image, and one stimulus per 200. And then you just increment the stimulus through the time series, and it takes you however many minutes to collect one entire.
It takes you the number of phase encode steps that you have to acquire the full volume / image.
Yeah. And then, so for the number of, so if you're trying to sort of titrate right through the response, you're then incrementing through the stimulus timing through K-space, then how long does it take to get one full experiment? So you've got
One full
Basically
experiment, I think, was something like close to 15 minutes, 14
15
minutes,
minutes.
something
Okay.
of that
Because I
order.
think that's, yeah, because this is one of the things where, you know, when you and I were interviewed for the 2022 article, that was one of the things I brought up was this translation, which I think we should definitely do to death later on, because I think there's a big disconnect between the animal physiological measurements and what people think when they think fMRI and what
Yeah,
would be deliverable in an actual
absolutely. I mean, my
package.
first comment to them was that, you know, this is, even if it worked, it is completely impractical
Yep.
as it stands. And, you know, maybe somebody would come up with some clever approach, but, you know, the fact that you have to present the stimulus as many times as you have phasing code steps basically makes this impractical from an acquisition time perspective, but it's also unreasonable to expect a human subject to pay attention to a stimulus 200 times in a row, for example,
Or
or
at least with
120 times
the same
with
level of
the,
attention. Right.
exactly, right? So you're going to get that modulation as you move through K space.
Which would be considerable for even for primary cortex. And then,
Yeah.
of course, you can synchronize primary cortex. You could do S1, M1, V1, pick any, but you
Yeah.
can't. You're not doing emotion. You're not doing language. You're not doing
No, I mean, anything
information.
higher order,
Yeah,
you would
just
have
can't.
no idea when it was happening,
Yeah,
actually.
yeah,
You'd
yeah,
have to
yeah.
actually trigger off an evoked potential or something, perhaps.
Yeah, and again, you still would then have all of the arousal feedback and feed
Yeah,
forward,
yeah,
and how would that modulate the underlying activity? And then also, given that you are required to circumvent some of the physiology, right? You have to make the assumption that the other stuff, the bold, primarily is constant. Does that assumption continue to hold as well? That's also always another
yeah.
question. So cool. All right, that's good. So we're on the same page there. So, so you tried this your Diana version in what 2022, 2023 when you
Yeah, with very, like within weeks of
yeah,
the my
okay.
archive
And
paper
I'm
coming
sure you're
out.
not alone. I'm sure other people did.
And I know people in Australia did, for example, quite quickly as
Right.
well. I'm not sure who else tried it. I think Peter Bannattini tried it pretty
Probably.
quickly too,
Yeah.
using essentially the same stimulus, or maybe identical to what we were doing. I can't remember whether he did visual or some kind of tactile thing, but
Was he at 3T or 7T?
70, I
At
think.
7T as well. Okay.
Yeah.
You guys all went to the big.
Yeah, and we got nothing. I
Yeah.
mean, absolutely nothing. I mean, if you squint at it and you are selective in what you think is a trial or not, you can make something, but you can make anything out of noise, basically.
You can. Okay, so that's a good segue. So when did you start talking to Peter and Sanji about doing something,
So
framing it to
Sanji
replicate?
did very careful experiments after that, and after we learned a little bit more about what we thought was going on in Dr. Park's group and in the experiments there. So Sanji essentially repeated those experiments with two major, what should have been improvements. So it's not the identical. So the pulse sequence was identical, stimulus was identical, triggering was identical, but we wanted more SNR just to be safe. So we did this at 15.2T. Ours wasn't delivered yet, so Sanji did his. And we also knew that the anesthetic that they used, so, you know, injectable anesthetic causes, you know, fading, of course, in the anesthesia, and then you have to give another bolus, and that's not the best way to do it. So we went with a gas anesthetic because you can really maintain the animals flat. And Sanji's lab has extraordinary experience in keeping these animals, you know, light but stable, right? So isoflurane, not the greatest anesthetic, of course, for bold type experiments, but they have the recipe to do this really
Gotcha.
well.
Yeah, that was a nice part of your paper. I did like that. So that could then the variability in the anesthesia level in the original Park paper could have been one of the sources of considerable variation that could have
Yeah, and it could. And
contributed
you
to
know,
some of their
when I asked him about, not specifically the anesthesia, but I asked him a couple of questions that I asked him in Toronto last year. He said they were selective about the trials because not every trial gives a response. That's verbatim what he said.
Yeah.
And that is, if you look at the single unit literature, I mean, it's certainly true that if you look at a single unit in response to, say, visual or tactile stimulation, not every unit fires on every trial.
Yeah.
However, the population always fires.
Yeah.
So, and in bold and fMRI, we are measuring hundreds of thousands to millions of neurons. So that population should always be firing. So I wondered at that point whether, at certain depths of anesthesia, maybe they were not getting responses, so they threw those out, which is actually legitimate if you have a independent way of actually looking at that. But of course they didn't. So
it would have been an interesting physiologic modulator.
Yeah.
Like attention.
Like attention. I mean, it is essentially it's essentially a surrogate for consciousness, right?
Right. Yeah, that's clever. Okay, that's cool. So the same sequence. So the same. God, I'm jealous of you with your whiskey. God damn you. Maybe tomorrow night I'm going out with the Indian buddy of mine. He loves 18-year-old malts, so maybe I'll get some.
Well, there you go.
Yeah. So the same sequence. So the same, presumably that assumed the same 12 microsecond triggering delay that was present only in trials with a stimulus. That's what Jasanoff showed in his.
Yeah. So the Sanji's console on the 15.2T is the same as the ones that are on the 9.4T.
Must have the same.
So it must have the same thing. We have a Neo, which Sanji's trying to upgrade to right now. So it may be slightly different. But we've looked at this now on our Neo, and it's not clear to us that the same triggering delay is there, but we've tried this in multiple ways. So we have actually inserted a 12 microsecond delay in the non-trigger. So there's an if statement, basically. And if the trigger is go, you apply the trigger. If it's not, you put a 12 microsecond delay.
So you're compensating for that now.
So we would be compensating for it.
That's beautiful. So because one of the open questions I had in reading the two of your papers together was yours and Jasanoff's was okay, well, you're at 15.2T, you have the same, he did rat, you did mouse, which is the same as the Park paper. So there's a different species, probably a different anesthesia regimen, different surface coil size, but these are very small, and then different field strength, which is a big one, because as Jasanoff shows, in simulations, that triggering delay and the T1 and T2 and line width through T2 star.
Yeah, so I mean, those are all field dependent parameters, so they
can all be simulated. Right. So it would be fairly easy for Jasanoff to simulate your parameters at 15.2T and see, okay, how big of an effect would I expect to see, bigger or smaller than they saw in 9.4. Yeah.
So I have to tell you, so we're doing other experiments right now, where the SNR is between 1,000 and 10,000 times higher than in Sanji's paper, for example. So we're using implantable probes. This is at 9.4T right now. So we have 100 micron diameter probes that look like electrodes that we insert into the brain. And we also just do a small burr hole, and we have a ID is, I believe, 600 micron surface coil, basically, that sits on the brain surface over V1.
Is it direct drive? Is it transmit receive?
It's transmit receive, yes.
Okay. Wow, a little microcoil. Holy cow.
So they're little microcoils, and we see nothing with either one. The noise level is still about 0.2%. I mean, there's physiologic noise.
Physiologic noise. Well, you mean, noise. You mean that the fact the baseline signal.
Yeah.
It's not,
and we cannot go below that right now.
Yeah.
So that is coming from the physiology.
Yeah, that makes sense. Good. mean, that means that the physiology's there and the animals are
Yeah, so we're physiologically noise dominated here. We know of a way to get rid of this. I'm not ready to talk about that.
Okay.
It was developed completely independently for a different set of experiments that a student of mine is writing up right now. So we could probably reduce that physiologic noise if we gate with cardiac and respiration together simultaneously. We could reduce that probably an order of magnitude. So it'll go down to 0.02%.
Wow. Well, can you
I'm not holding out any hope necessarily for that.
Yeah.
The solid signal is a different story. So as an NMR guy, you might appreciate that. So that looks kind of interesting. But it's not something that any of us doing imaging sequences would have seen, because it's gone in microseconds.
Yeah. So, okay, yeah, because this gets back to like things like MREG. Ultimately, none of this is noise. We use the wrong term, right? It's all information. It's
information, yeah.
It's signals we don't understand or signals that we poorly control. So we have all of the ongoing CBV fluctuations, the changes in arterial O2, the SaO2 modulates a little bit. Obviously, CO2 modulating CBV. And all that stuff is propagating, in a non-stationary fashion. And then on top of that, you've got all this super interesting stuff, which people like Kleinfeld will tell you is like your intrinsic limit for resting state, which would be down at the endothelial level, which would be feed forward, feed backward communication between the endothelia and stuff that's all the true resting state signal, which is the stuff that the resting state folks are actually interested in. And presumably that isn't something that's phase locked. You can only measure it. You can't.
Yeah, you can only measure it unless you know what's driving it. You can't phase lock.
Right, exactly. You'd have to have probes somewhere either in the peripheral nervous system to measure arousal or something else to know why this animal is doing what it's doing.
So we believe we can do that, but we're with a new sequence that, well, it's a standard sequence, but a new way of doing it.
And then the solid stuff you say, so I'll let you figure that out. But I'd be fascinated. So you're seeing all kinds of stuff that's possibly to do.
Well, I wouldn't say all kinds of stuff. We're seeing the hint of something that might change at the microsecond level. But as the Jasanoff paper, that's a pretty good caveat that you better do all the control conditions to convince yourself that this is actually real.
Okay, interesting. All right, well, I'll be fascinated to see that. Because even if it turns out to be an artifact, I think that's, to me, the lesson of these two papers, your refutation papers, is that this is how science should get done. This is awesome because we're having this conversation. We're thinking much deeper thoughts about stuff that everybody's interested in. This is cool.
And when you're dealing with signals this small, artifacts are super important. It's pretty hard to screw up a bold experiment, but it's really easy to screw these kinds of experiments.
Yeah. Awesome. That's really cool. Well, I'm going to be super interested to see what comes of that, because I haven't looked at the solid stuff, whether it's myelin or something else, myelin water or some other fraction, who knows? Intracellular fraction, who knows? We'll see. That's very cool. So I think, unless you have anything else you want to say about the Jasanoff paper, or I presume you've read the Jasanoff paper.
Yeah. I mean, it's I think pretty thorough. It was very interesting because it starts off very positive, and we did this experiment and we got the exact same result. And then he proceeds to dissect why it shows up where it does. Well, it's because you're looking for your keys under a light.
The drunk guy under the lamp.
The drunk guy under the light. So you put a surface coil over the area expected. Of course you get signal there. And then we know these triggers and things like that. There are subtleties. We knew it with the Varian console, and it obviously is true even with the Bruker console. So you have to be really careful when you start looking.
So that's a really important point, worth emphasizing for people who don't understand that the whole premise of your paper is it's the drunk man under the light looking for the keys, and Jasanoff deals with that. But I think it's the important point is what you've just said about fluctuations. That baseline is fluctuation at 0.2%, let's say, but that's not everywhere. The fluctuations are bigger in areas where you're expecting them to fluctuate the most.
Exactly.
The experiment. So under S1, it's going up 2%, not 0.2.
Yeah.
So of course, now the
You have
chance
more
of getting
noise, so you can make even more out of it.
correct. So now your false positives are elevated. So of course, you're going to have to be much more cautious about interpreting any change there. I think it's a super important point. Not quite a dead salmon point, but not far off.
Yeah.
Right.
Not
I
far
think
off. Yeah.
a good reminder for people to, when you bias your experiment, you start canting your surface coil one way, and you make sure that the received profile is just so over S1. Well, duh. Of course, you can get
exactly.
many
That's
more
the
false
only place
positives
you're
under
going to
S1.
get signal. Yeah.
Well, even if you were trying to study M1 or V1, in that
Yeah.
case, you would still expect there to be more false positives under S1.
Yeah.
Right? Because that's fluctuating more, because that's how the brain is wired. So yeah, makes a lot of sense. I think it's a really important point. Cool. Was there anything else you wanted to mention about your study or the Jasanoff study for?
No, so I mean,
Brainwide?
within, Peter and I threw back a lot of suggestions to Sanji and his group once we read the initial drafts of the paper. They went back and did additional analyses based on those. And we basically showed how we could get a result, but it's not a statistically valid approach to do so. The only way it was valid is if you had an EEG electrode in there or LFP electrode in there, and you could discard trials based on no activity, in an electrophysiologic sense.
Yeah.
So we could basically make any signal we wanted.
Yeah.
This is actually a criticism that used to come, in my early ocular dominance column work. They said, well, your SNR is so low, you can make columns just out of noise, if you do the right thing, which is, a legitimate concern. Except lots of people were able to reproduce that over the years using different paradigms, different labs, different. And I think that's the key here.
Well, weren't you also able to rotate the gradient and just change the ocular dominance?
Yeah.
You could deterministically control what.
Well, you can't change the ocular dominance.
No, but you can control which ones are firing to which.
Left and right eye, but with a noisy signal and some kind of square wave detection, like a GLM or that kind of approach, you can still make something that looks like columns. And there's in the image processing literature, in the vision processing literature, there are actually papers on this, where you can make patterns of orientation or ocular dominance because the signal is so noisy, right?
Yeah. Okay. Well,
but the key is that other people could reproduce it, reading the methods of your papers, and maybe they add their own twist on it, they have their own improvements on it. Kang Cheng did a beautiful study a few years after we did. And he did it better, and he got beautiful data.
Right. It should be as possible as if you can't change field strength, pulse sequence slightly, or whatever, it's not a real
species, all of these things. It can't be only one lab in the world in only one species can do it. And I think you go back to within the first 3 months or 6 months of the publication of the 3 seminal Bolt papers from MCW, MGH, and Minnesota, there were a dozen labs that had reproduced it, going from 1.5 T to 3 T to 4 T. So anybody could do it.
And a big difference there is that Seiji had given a mechanism, so you knew what the principle was. So if you understood the principle, you could adapt that principle for your particular sequence type. You could have gone straight into spin echo, for example, and you would have been able to think through the implications of that, because you had a mechanism, the postulated mechanism that made sense. Whereas in Park's case, you have sort of a hand wavy description. There may be a change in T2.
You have a hand wavy description, and there's the subsequent paper in bioRxiv, which is, I'm a little stunned that they're even considering publishing this, because the effect they report has been known for 40 years,
I was actually in London when as soon as I read this, it's like, oh my God, it's cortical spreading depression. Nick van Bruggen was doing this when I was doing my PhD in London.
Well, it's not even that. So it's, I mean, so what they show, so they keep claiming in that paper that this is membrane polarization or depolarization.
Yeah, which we know.
It's not. It's osmotic gradients that cause cell swelling. And they mentioned that right at the end of their paper. They said a possible other mechanism is this. My entire PhD thesis was on this.
Yep.
You know, with red blood cell dose, and you change the osmolarity, and what you change is the ratio of the intracellular to the extracellular space. That only works when you have cell pellets, which is exactly what they did. They centrifuge their data down into cell pellets. Now you have water exchanging and fast exchange between the inside of the cell and the outside of the cell. And when you depolarize the cell, it swells. And when you hyperpolarize the cell, it shrinks. And the T2 values go exactly as has been reported decades ago in bioreactors.
Yeah, exactly. And even in animals, because they cap it all by doing what would have been otherwise a CSD type experiment that Gardner Medwin and Nick van Bruggen reported in the early 90s.
Yeah, so you get spreading depression.
But they didn't get spreading depression. That was kind of their cop-out, with their excuse was, well, we didn't get spreading depression, therefore it's not. But I went, they were saying, well, when you do CSD type experiments, you drop one molar potassium on the cortex. Well, no, I mean, Nick and Gardner Medwin, they were doing 150 millimolar, and Park was using 80. Well, that's not a big difference. So the fact they didn't see a spreading wave, maybe they didn't detect it. Maybe they were just sub-threshold, but either way, it's still osmolar. It's not a functional response. I mean, it's minutes.
Yeah, it's minutes. Exactly.
And if they had CSD, that spreading depression, there's a lovely video actually on Wikipedia of these spreading waves of electrical activity. It's beautiful. And it's 1 to 2 millimeters a minute. So you're talking about a few minutes before it renormalizes, and then you can't have action potentials during that time. And it's all very, very well known, very well documented physiology, classic literature from the 40s and 50s, I believe.
Yeah, and people did this T2 stuff and T1 stuff and T1 row stuff in cell pellets way early on in the NMR literature, looking to see what happens when cells swell and cells shrink. And
I think the Gardner Medwin and Van Bruggen papers, I think they were published in about 93, 94-ish. They were almost certainly reporting bold. They hadn't mentioned it in the paper, but that was 2 years after you guys had shown bold in humans, and so they were aware of that, and that's probably what they were reporting in their animals, because it's such a big effect.
Yeah. So what they needed to do was show that you can detect the signal, in a rapidly depolarized thing, but that's not what they show, right?
Right. No, exactly.
They should have done their experiment. Their original experiment using the same Diana sequence. With some method of rapidly depolarizing, which we know that method, it's called an action potential.
Right, exactly. Yep. Which is what this is not.
Yeah, which is what this is not. Exactly.
So it's two joint crimes. One is that it's not it's not related to what they in their first Diana paper. It's not related to that at all. It's a different. It's more closely related to aura, migraine, stroke, penumbra.
Yeah, and it's probably more related to maybe some of the things that Denis Lebihan has reported with diffusion, for example.
Yeah, exactly. Right. But also the other sort of mistake is that it's not even a good demonstration of osmolar changes or CSD. If that had been their intention, we could have cited all that literature, and they would have known, well, there's nothing left much to do here, kids. We should probably.
Yeah. So I was kind of excited when actually you first flagged that paper, because I hadn't seen it. When I read it, I was like, I read it several times because I thought, am I just dense and I'm missing the connection with the Diana paper?
Okay, so it's not just me. Good.
But no, there is no connection with the Diana paper.
Okay, then that's an important point. So I think maybe that's something
it's related to stroke. It's related to spreading depression. It's related to things like that. It has nothing to do with the Diana effect.
But even they're missing a huge chunk of literature, and they'll find that in their hands, there's probably very little for them to contribute. That's not 3 decades plus old, even in the MR literature.
Yeah.
So I don't see that they have a new angle there. But okay, well, that's cool. So I didn't miss anything. Do you? So let's ask the thought experiment question. What could they do with an action potential if they wanted to go back and drop the potassium on the cortex malarkey? If they go back to something that looks more Diana-like and they want to fire action potentials, what's left for them to investigate that could be Diana? Or do you think they're just completely wasting their time now?
Well, I think they're probably completely wasting their time with the technology. I mean, if you wanted to do a Diana-style experiment, you'd take a large axon of some sort from a squid or a crayfish,
Yeah,
a plasia.
yeah.
You'd wrap a solenoid around it so that you had a really good filling factor and a really good SNR. You would stick a micropipette into the neuron and then you'd fire it.
Okay. No,
or you'd do it with opto or something.
Or opto. Okay. Well, that's actually funny enough. Lucio Freedman's in town next Monday, I hear. So maybe if I go to the talk, maybe I'll mention it because I know that he's done stuff like that with Noam Shemesh and Sam Grant at Magnet Lab. So that would be the place to do that kind of thing, maybe with Steve Blackband or somebody, and go and play games with that.
Yeah,
so,
but I don't think, I mean, see, SNR is not the limit. So, you know, having those crazy high magnets like at the National Magnet Lab isn't actually going to make the difference because the physiology is setting your baseline noise.
Right. So I think that's the key insight. You need to have somebody who really understands what's happening in these systems. What are the osmolytes? What is the osmolarity? What, you know,
so if you have a single neuron, you won't have all those compounds. You have no vasculature, no attention, you have no blood flow, you have none of this stuff. And then you can actually look. And people have done that and not been successful. I mean,
so why haven't if they've done this and published it, why hasn't it killed the why do we still have this cottage industry? Why are people still chasing
well, because people forget. You know, there's probably a generational forgetfulness, and people repeat the same experiments, maybe a little bit better each time because the technology moves on, but they forget. You know, originally people were looking for magnetic fields from these and hoping they would affect the NMR signal in some way. But you know, many people have done the calculations. Peter Banatini's done some elegant calculations. And I forget, but I think it's something 4 to 6 orders of magnitude away from what was detectable with NMR. You can see it with a squid, but that's MEG basically.
Exactly. That's how I got into ultra low field. Was trying to debunk this Chong Fox Gao paper in 2003.
Oh yeah.
And very quickly realized that the CBV confound of your baseline was way bigger. So hey, might as well go try and exploit that rather than fiddle around with this other thing. And when you're at such a high field, you know, that's where high field is your enemy, right? Because now susceptibility will kill you, right? Now bold is just going to be a pernicious weed. And that's why we went to ultra low.
That's right, because the optimum TE for bold is like 10 milliseconds at 15.2 T or something like that, 8 to 10 milliseconds, which is impinging very closely on the kinds of things that we're talking about, the timescales we're looking at.
Yeah, that's crazy. Well, I wonder what else people might do. So do you think the neuronal current stuff is dead? I mean, I should ask Peter, I suppose. Is he still entertaining the
Peter's working on some very interesting stuff. I won't steal his thunder. And he's being very careful about it and very cautious about it. It's a different spatial scale than what we're talking about here. I think he has an abstract of this year's ISMRM or OHPM or both. But he's still trying to convince himself that it's real. It's different. Sanji and him and I have had discussions around what maybe is being reflected. So
interesting.
It's possible that bulk flow of ionic currents might still get you something, but it's not going to get you localization that's any better than, or even as good maybe as EEG or something like that. So you have to be
what's the physical process? Like a Hall effect?
No, I don't think so. I think the physical process would be, it's a good question. I mean, it's bulk ionic flow, which generates magnetic fields.
I thought that was a Hall effect. Okay, I'll have to look it up. It's been a long
Well,
time.
that is the Hall effect in a solid.
Oh, okay.
I guess, well, maybe it's called the Hall effect even
Okay.
in
I'll look it
a
up. That's
fluid.
curious.
But
So
yeah,
flowing charges basically. Okay, so no.
yeah, so moving charges, yes.
Okay, cool. Okay, well that's interesting. Well, I'll
Which
be
is an interesting, there's I don't know if you've been following this glymphatic literature and
Oh yeah, I've been
simulation with
involved in some of the
gamma.
peripheral work on that. Yeah.
So there's a recent paper from a group that suggests, so there are two competing hypotheses on why 40 hertz type stimulation increases glymphatic clearance. So one group suggests that essentially you're increasing vascular pulsatility, and this is pumping, causing pressure waves that essentially pressurize the interstitial fluid, and it pushes it out the lymph system. The other group, so these are two papers published back to back in Nature, actually, fairly recently, February 28th, as a matter of fact. The other one suggests that, in fact, it's ionic currents that are driving the flow. That seems a little far-fetched to me. I mean, they're basing this on the use of an extracellular electrode, and electrodes measure extracellular currents, but I haven't got my head fully around this argument. But let's say it's valid, then that means that there are flowing currents which are substantial enough that they could potentially generate magnetic fields.
Depending on how you get your voxels so that you get the right.
Yeah, so this is the problem. So, with the neurophysiologic recording, without, a single point electrode on a laminar array, that kind of thing, your sensitive volume is about 100 microns. So within 100 microns, you're looking at single neurons and oriented flow, perhaps. But with fMRI, you're never looking at that. You're looking at some tangled mess of ionic currents.
Yeah.
And the average of those currents will be, if it's extracellular fluid currents, is going to average to 0.
Yeah. Over a big enough length.
Only the bulk, MEG doesn't measure those tiny neurons and their currents. It measures, large axon transmission, population averages in tracts, basically.
That's interesting. And the 40 hertz stimulation, this is for awake people. They say they're driving.
So this is mostly, no, this has all been done in animal models.
Okay.
So there's a group at MIT.
Are they all anesthetized, or are they restrained, awake?
There's a mix. I think they're anesthetized.
Okay.
Actually, there's a mix, because nobody's really doing MRI except to show the glymphatic clearance with that contrast agent. But nobody's using
that.
MRI.
Are they doing an injection into the
cisterna,
and then looking for clearance? But it's got to get into the brain before it can clear first.
Yes, that's right. So they look at both phases, actually.
Okay. And then there is so do both phases get faster?
Yes. Yes. According to this paper, they both do.
That's interesting. Okay. Because I'm definitely going to talk to some people. You've reminded me I need to talk to some people about this, because I've been involved in some of the pulsatility in the fourth ventricle, some of those experiments, just the basic biomechanics, sorting out the different respiratory contributions to the CSF flow at what I think of as a pop-off valve, right? Always turn it into a physical system, right?
Yeah.
That's what we do, right? But the one thing that really always perplexed me about this, going right back to 3 years ago, to Laura Lewis's paper, is in sleeping subjects. If you stage 3, I think there's only a stage 3 now. I think they did away with stage 4 sleep, whatever, inflation. But anyway, when you get into the deep non-REM sleep, which is where the putative glymphatics is, the clearance mechanism.
Yeah, because those are the slow wave.
Right. And according to her data, this is where you start to see these big deltas that correlate very nicely with the slow wave. The thing that always confuses me about this is why nobody's answered this for me yet, but as far as I understand, most people, when you go into deep sleep, you start to become slightly hypercapnic. And
yes, that's right.
So the CO2 is got right. So now you've got that big shift on top.
Yeah.
If you're gonna, so if suddenly the brain is going to shift to this new state where the electrical activity, the brain-wide electrical activity is going to concert to squeeze and do the cleaning mechanism, then at the same time you've got to dial down the intrinsic CO2 sensitivity. If it's left the same as in the awake case, which we know is very strong, then surely that's going to dominate. It's going to wash this stuff out anyway, at least on the MR signal, because the CBV is going to be going up and down.
Oh, it's way bigger.
Okay, yeah, right. Especially in hypercapnia, right? Which we all become slightly hypercapnic, even if we're not.
Yeah. So the MRT group has shown in animals, first with opto and then with multimodal sensory stimulation, so vision and auditory together at 40 hertz, that when you stimulate at this gamma band frequency, that you can increase clearance of A beta, for example, in the brains of Alzheimer's mice.
Yeah.
That was published in a Nature paper as well a few years ago.
Quick side note to that though, the Jagus group and somebody else, I forget, already showed that A beta is a epiphenomenon, that tau is much more important.
Right. So
anyway, carry on.
So tau, of course, is intracellular, and so it's a lot harder to wash that out.
Yeah.
But there's some evidence that alpha-synuclein also benefits from this, which is in FTD and Parkinson's. So those are synucleinopathies. So it's interesting. I mean, maybe both tau and A beta are both epiphenomenal. We won't go into that because all the monoclonal antibodies seem to clear.
You're just going to do this industry, aren't you? They already had an existential crisis over amyloid.
Yeah, and the problem with amyloid is you clear it. I mean, it works. These drugs work. Aducanumab works. Lecanemab works, but they don't improve cognition. So something else is going on.
Right.
And what that is interesting. But they have a lot of side effects.
Yeah.
If you could do something, with stimulation of gamma band or something like that, and clear A beta or some other mystery molecule that we don't know about yet, that would be better. It's completely harmless. So actually FDA has done there've been 2 clinical trials already with humans on this. And they've both not shown any improvement in A beta clearance. They've been doing 40 hertz 1 hour a day. So you basically sit in front of a screen that flickers at 40 hertz for an hour a day, which, it's phase 1. So they're, looking at safety basically. Hopefully it's not epileptogenic or something, I guess, which it could be, of course.
It's just boring.
Yeah, it's just really boring.
That's really worse than watching CNN for an hour. All right.
Yeah. But, the flip side is, the glymph community, the glymphatic clearance community says, well, this improves during sleep. That's when, and that there is not high gamma activity at that point. It's high power in the delta band, basically.
Yeah.
And so, and that in some ways makes sense because, you have slow waves with high power. That's a high energy density at a low frequency. Maybe that drives the vasculature to do the pumping. Who knows?
Yeah, or it is truly a neural process, a brain-wide concerted, that you do need to dumb down the CO2 and the ongoing vascular responses so that you can get this sort of, squeezing brain-wide that is somehow sort of increasing the extracellular fluid or CSF flow through the channels that matter, whether they're lymphatic or not, whichever. I mean, in a way, to me, I'm less interested. The plumbing is interesting, right? Obviously, there's an academic question there. What is the route through the?
Yeah, well, I mean, the only way to get,
but then there's the sleep. The sleep effect is
either to increase the interstitial fluid, or change the Km so that the exchange rate has to change. And aquaporin is supposed to be the mediating channel for this. So that means you have to change the aquaporin open time or its diameter or something like that in some kind of neuronally coupled manner, which nobody clearly has a mechanism for.
Right. That's interesting. Well, yeah, this is stuff that, I mean, I got loads of questions about these sorts of things. I mean, especially really funny, you know, because even with the causal arrow for Alzheimer's is not clear to me. You know, you see vascular effects, but what if the vascular effects are the causal effects? What if it's a consequence of low vascular tone, you know, whatever reactivity, etc.? Then Alzheimer's rather than the other way around. Who knows? Maybe it's both at the same
Well, very
time.
nice. I mean, it's highly likely. I mean, you know, the ApoE4, you know, sort of the genetic sort of precursors to Alzheimer's that, you know, all the animal modeling people like to use, the transgenic modeling people like to use. I mean, they account for a minute fraction of Alzheimer's. I mean, most of the sporadic Alzheimer's is very likely coming from vascular aspects, you know, and, you know, in large part, it's probably a vascular dementia effect. Maybe it's a reduction in clearance, you know, lymph clearance, who knows, you know, something like that. All of which are, you know, lifestyle modifiable. You know, a lot of these things are modifiable.
Exactly. And I know that, yeah, poor sleep is a high risk factor, right? For
yeah, exactly.
So then you go
poor
back
sleep
to
is a very high risk factor for AD.
Yeah. So if you had, yeah, so poor sleep and apnea, and so you have a higher CO2 response. If you're not getting to the point where you're dialing down the CO2 reactivity, you'll never get to the concerted brain-wide activity that can then be.
Right.
You never get the proper rinse cycle.
So that physiologic noise is so much larger than the kinds of signals we've been talking about.
Yeah.
You really have to figure out how to control or eliminate them or something.
Yeah.
If you want to look below that.
Yeah. There's a lot of, I mean, that's what these Parkinson guys should be working on, in my opinion. I mean, there's such an amount of work to do there, especially, it's so hard, especially with sleep. Sleep's hard enough anyway. Measuring EEG in the scanner or some other measure of arousal, so you can try and stage sleep. Maybe you can do it from the MR data itself. You know, if you're very good, you know, if you have baseline.
It's hard, but I mean, there are people who claim they can, but
they claim they can. Yeah, maybe that's one for deep learning. Who knows? But yeah, there seems like that's an area where, you know, all of the stuff I've seen it seems very rudimentary so far. That some clever experiments could really make a big difference.
Yeah. Well, I think, I mean, this is the point where, you know, biophysicists really have to be looking at. You have to be well versed in the neuroscience.
Yeah.
You have to be well versed in the NMR.
Yeah. Right.
And if you're only good at one or the other, you are going to make mistakes.
Yeah. Yeah.
You're going to misinterpret data, and you're going to design bad experiments.
Yeah. 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 Quite so. Yeah, that's super interesting. Well, yes, the sleep and anytime I hear glymphatics, I hear sleep, because I think that's the more interesting angle for this stuff for me anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. No, for sure. And you know, what would you rather do? I mean, to reduce your risk of Alzheimer's, would you stare, or even if you had A beta, would you like to stare at a flickering screen at 40 hertz for an hour, or just get a better night's sleep?
Yeah. It's the same with all recovery, with your plasticity, etc. We know the answer. Get more exercise.
Yeah,
we know the answer. If you could put it in a little blue pill, it's worth millions of dollars.
But you know, I'm tired of. I mean, there's so many calls for funding that I see where they specifically exclude things like physical activity or diet in the
mean
call.
The answer, the solution? They exclude
because they're very focused on a pill a day kind of approaches, right?
Yeah. Well, that's well beyond our pay grade.
That's well beyond my pay grade. Although I do have a $24 million grant, which is aimed at actually looking at better preclinical models and better ways to assess those preclinical models in a multi-center reproducible manner. Because
preclinical, okay.
Yeah, preclinical.
Yeah, because if it was clinical, anytime I see any brain training stuff or any therapy, my first question is, why don't you have a control group that's just doing exercise for the same amount of time a week?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it may stun you to know, because it certainly stunned me to know that for FDA to give you the approval to go forward to a phase 0 or 1, 2, or 3 trial, you only need preclinical data from one place. And so you end up often with people who have a vested interest in their data looking good. So nobody does multi-site.
We'd call them scientists, I believe. Research.
Well, they're scientists, and of course, scientists are very enthusiastic. And but many of these scientists have startup companies based around their small molecules or their biotherapy.
Scientists with conflicts of interest.
Okay. Yes, exactly. Okay. So our approach is actually to say, you know what, we're going to do these in multiple sites, and we're not going to actually do any of the drugs we do. We're going to do other people's drugs. So Biogen or other scientists.
Have you, your address is not public, right? You might just want to go into well, you live in Canada, so no one knows how to get into Canada from this state.
Nobody knows how to get into Canada.
You're good. You're okay. Yeah. No one's likely to come up there and knock you off. You're already essentially in witness protection, right?
Effectively, yes, because first you have to find Canada, which
exactly.
a large number of Americans probably couldn't do it. So
I saw somebody call Canada the other day Arctic Mexico.
Well, I know. I mean, when we moved to Canada in 1979, we were in Maryland, and my classmate, I was in grade 10, and my classmates literally asked, I mean, genuinely, not sarcastically, how many bedrooms our igloo would have.
What did you tell them? 3?
I said 3.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
And we've got an indoor toilet.
We have a 3-bedroom igloo in Vancouver.
Yeah, that's so funny.
Turns out my dad bought a 5-bedroom igloo in Vancouver, as it turned out.
That's funny. That's funny. All right, dude. Well, I think we've been on for getting on to an hour. So anything else you want to bring up about anything? Life, the universe, stock tips? Should you buy Bitcoin?
Oh, don't buy Bitcoin.
It's too late. You've missed the run up.
I missed the run up, yeah. I think even the vintage Porsche scene might have flattened out. So don't buy a vintage Porsche right now either.
You know what I just came across? So I just got talking to some guys. I saw a guy with an MGA Tyrolite Green. Unbelievable car. So he's the second owner. He bought it from a woman pilot.
It'll never be worth anything though.
But... No, but he drives it as his daily driver. But to his yacht club where he said it was because he retired. But that got me. I'm thinking, yeah, I need a classic car just to mess around and do some rallies and stuff. I've been looking at a Fiat Dino.
Oh.
Yeah. Oh, exactly.
Oh. Well, again, compare that to the Ferrari Dino.
Never liked the Ferrari Dino, even though I've actually touched the white Ferrari Dino that Jack May won the Cannonball Run, the second to last real Cannonball Run in the 70s. Michael Jack May won it. It was the fastest record time then. It was beaten the following year, which was the final year that they did the real Cannonball. And I used to do some consulting for him and his cousin 25 years ago.
Small world.
I couldn't believe it when he showed me this car. It's unbelievable. I happen to know where it is. Somewhere in Florida. I shall keep the address quiet. I don't even know if Jack May's still alive, but I've touched that car. But apart from that, I was never a huge fan of the Ferrari Dino, but the Fiat Dino is just, such an understated, cool looking machine.
But see, those are affordable cars, and so why not?
Well, yeah, and nice. I mean, other than that, I
not
think
super reliable, but
it's 1970s or 1960s Italian car. There's no such thing as reliable. There's no Italian word for reliable.
No. I have a colleague of mine who has a 1973 Fiat, and it looks nice.
but it's parked all the time.
But it's parked a lot of the time. Yes.
That's funny. Yeah, I don't know what I'll do. I mean, maybe let's get through this election first. I ain't doing damn thing until November the 7th or whatever the damn date is. Once I know what's going on in this insane country.
Actually, Anne and I renounced last April. So
I heard. Yeah. Well, the only benefit so far is that you don't have to do a tax return.
Well, we still have to file this year, but next year we won't. So that will be, and I won't have to make any kind of electoral choices. So
yeah, no, you can spectate with another big whiskey in November and wonder whether the country south of you is going to go to hell or not.
Well, the problem is, if you go to hell, we go to hell.
It's a global. I know
It's
it's
a
just
global
the order in
phenomenon,
which we go to hell.
right? This
Right?
is the problem. If Canada goes to hell, nobody notices. But if America goes to hell, a lot of people notice.
Yeah. That's for sure. Absolutely for sure. Well, let's hope it doesn't happen. Let's fingers crossed. I got plans, but predictions
Fingers
aren't. Yeah.
crossed. Yeah.
Well, this isn't much of a plan, but I have plans.
Well, I
So
mean, California could secede from the Union, I suppose.
yeah, but even that'll take a long time. It would be resistance before that, and I'm not sure I even want to hang out for that particular set of circumstances. I mean,
Yeah.
can you imagine having a no-fly zone? You'd fly from SFO straight up the coast over Canada, thank you, then back down to the UK because you're not allowed to fly over the middle of the country.
Well, Costa Rica is not too far from you. It's just down the coast a bit.
No,
Yeah.
I think I still got another passport I can rely on. I hope.
Yeah, well, really? You want to go back there? Really?
Well, now I'm rich compared to where they're screwed.
That is true. That's true. I mean,
Yeah.
much as academics in the United States and Canada like to complain, we
Correct.
are so much better off than our colleagues.
Correct. Yeah. Now there's a bunch of Brits going rumbling into their tea right now. So, anything else you want to talk about with Diana or the park stuff? I think we did that to death.
No, I think we've done that to death. I didn't appreciate the acronyms that Alan Jasanoff had picked, but
you didn't think that was very funny? It's clever, I thought.
It's very clever. It's very clever, actually. So I mean, they worked hard at that.
it's a kind of an obvious acronym the moment you see it.
No, it is. That's right. But I didn't see it because it actually appears on the second page of the paper.
Yeah.
And but yeah, I think Diana is dead, for sure. Not just a candle in the wind dead, it's dead.
Yep. I quite agree. I don't see it coming back. I think the takeaway I hope some people get from this is that all of these methods, even when assume it works just for a second in animals, taking that to the human and doing some useful experiment that's anything but electrophysiology writ large is almost impossible. The idea that you're going to suddenly make this a brain-wide, fast, general tool to replace your standard fMRI is just,
Yeah, and you got to. I mean, MRI people are snobs, and you got to be careful because we're trying to recreate EEG and MEG with MRI. Well, EEG and MRI and MEG already work, and they work really well.
Yeah.
And they have their limitations in terms of spatial resolution, and they have their benefits in terms of temporal resolution.
Yeah.
So if you're going to have an MRI technique that is still slow, well, it better have high spatial resolution. If it's going to be fast, then you better be able to do that with high spatial resolution.
Yeah.
Otherwise, why wouldn't you use EEG, which costs a hell of a lot less?
Yeah.
And OPMs, they're still expensive, but they're
Have you
portable.
played with MREG at all?
We do MREG, yeah.
Because that's kind of a nice technique. I mean, you do still have a partial inverse problem, right? When you
yeah, absolutely.
So you do reintroduce the ultimate limitation of EEG, MEG.
Yeah, you still have that problem. I mean, it's still an inverse problem with fewer detectors, in fact.
Yeah, many fewer, right.
Many fewer detectors. So, and this is kind of, if you talk to Peter, this is kind of the approach that they're using, not to steal his thunder, but, turning off the gradients, just using the coils for localization. But there's a spatial resolution limit there, obviously.
Yeah.
So even if you could get the temporal resolution MRI, why would you?
Right.
Unless you could then push that to higher spatial resolution.
Well, the reason I would do it, my motivation, and I hope maybe some other people pick this up, is to try to better understand the physiologic noise, which most folks just want to throw away. They treat it like there's a baby in a bathwater.
Yeah.
There is no baby in bathwater.
But see, that only interests you and Peter and me and people who are interested in that sort of stuff. But for the vast majority of people, that's just a confound. They don't want to deal with it. Yeah,
and I think there's the philosophical mistake, is to treat anything as a confound. If it contains information, you should try to understand it.
Right.
It might tell you something that, and especially if you do whole organism type stuff rather than brain floating in free space. If you think of it as an organism, maybe it's telling you something about arousal or something else that is actually of neural interest. if you understand it. So measure it and try and understand it. That to me is where the people's interest should be. We're getting the data, we're just not building the models to understand, to fully understand what we're actually measuring, what we're capturing. I think people like Blaise, Frederick, and others are doing us a service by trying to tease out things like vascular delays and understanding the global mean signal, not as a way of like,
You know, the number of people who do
Yeah.
that kind of work, you know, Blaise, Sanji, you know, people like that,
single digits.
it's single digits.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
you know, I assume, I mean, Sanji has funding because he has a lot of funding through his institute. Blaise probably has to battle with the NIH all the time because people go, well, why is this important, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we can do fMRI and, you know, it works, and like, why bother about this stuff?
Yeah.
But it's really important to do this.
Yeah. And to do it, to understand it, you can't just do a standard fMRI experiment. You might be able to understand all the signals that way if you get very lucky, but most likely you're going to need some other independent measurement to interpret it. Arousal through pupillometry, skin conductance, various measurements of pulsatility, blood pressure maybe. If you don't have all of those independent measures, you're probably not going to be able to properly characterize what you see in the MRI.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, this method I was alluding to, you know, very obliquely is, you know, basically we can now do fMRI very reliably in a non-steady state, which means you can gate off signals of interest instead of calling them confounds, and just start from zero and deal with the whole approach to steady state.
So start adding confounds.
Yeah, so, and so you can do that. You can trigger in any one of these things. You can behavioral, you could do it on pupil diameter, you could do it, you know, you don't need to have a MR in a steady state.
And then try and control each variable. So you could, for example, you could try
you could do all of that.
Try and change CO2. You could.
It has the added benefit of giving you several 100% more SNR.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. And presumably speed. Because you're
so I mean, it has the big benefit that you can do things like auditory or EEG recordings with zero gradient on,
right,
and then do your recording.
Yeah.
Right. So you could, the kinds of experiments we were talking about earlier, where you trigger off an LFP or a VEP, you can do.
Right. Wow.
And it doesn't have to be on any kind of raster. You can just do it.
Yeah. And then if there's a question, okay, there's a change, what is this change? What might this change be due to? Okay, if we need to modify blood pressure, we can do that. If we need to modify O2 or CO2, we can do that.
Exactly.
And to see whether it changes at all. Yeah, that's cool. Yeah,
I think this is going to be a game changer, and we'll see whether editors agree.
Wow. So that could, so maybe that's where the Parks of the world and the other animal physio labs and people are interested in this stuff, maybe that's where they need to shift their attention rather than chasing.
Yeah, but I think, you know, so, you know, I think he has a little bit of an MR background, because I think he was at the University of Minnesota for a while. But I think the danger is, you know, you have to have sort of either the single person who knows both fields or both fields well represented. Otherwise, you fall into these traps that we see that are occurring. So you really need a good MR background, and you know, you need to know that delays occur in pulse sequences. And
that was exactly what I got out of the Jasanoff paper. I hadn't read a paper and been that like, oh my god, why? Because it was like a reminder. There's like, you know, you think you know this stuff. You know, we're pulse programmers, you know, by training, by vocation.
We've always known this,
but
right?
We would have overlooked that. I'm like, oh shit, that's a reminder that, you know, that shit can still catch you out.
So when we first used to incorporate RF spoiling on the variant system, you know, we would go off resonance for a period of time and then come back on resonance, because they didn't have a phase coherent.
I remember that.
Remember that? So even on the Innova, you couldn't do that. And on the direct drive, you couldn't do that. And later version of the direct drive, you could. And so there were weird delays that occurred when you did that, which weren't in the manual, weren't anywhere, but you could measure them. Because when you're measuring phase, you have an extremely accurate measure of temporal things. So when you think it should be rotating 117 degrees and it's not, you know something's up,
The
right?
spins never lie. They are
Spins
the best
never lie.
detector of anything and everything.
Yeah. So,
Yeah.
you have to go down, and it was like mysterious little delays, a
Yeah.
couple of extra clock cycles in the 40 megahertz clock, right?
That's exactly. So when I saw the papers you guys, because what's her face, um um Preliman, she sent me those papers. I didn't even know, I'd forgotten all about the stuff that you were working on till she sent me those papers when they were embargoed. And when I glanced through it first, it was early morning. I'm like, let me just quickly look through this before I do what I'm supposed to do. And oh, this is great. This is interesting. And the first thing I thought when I saw the triggering delay was, oh my God, it's the busted clock and the faster than light neutrinos. But that happens, or the
Yeah,
dust
it
in
happens.
dust
Yeah,
in the cobalt in
absolutely.
the CMB,
Yeah,
right? That stuff will get you, and it'll give you 5 sigma, 6 sigma,
yeah,
right? So you think, oh my God, this is the result. No, it's a systematic problem with your measurement apparatus.
yeah.
And it happens, not just an MRI, obviously. It happens all over.
Oh, it
So
happens all over. I mean, we
yeah,
see
yeah.
these
You really got to know the
multiphoton microscopes and all
yeah,
sorts of things, right?
yeah, yeah.
And when you start looking for subtle effects, you have to worry about your instrumental anomalies.
Yeah, for sure. You've really got to know your machine. I think that's why, the guys that really do this stuff well, they kind of know how to disassemble and reassemble the machine. Because if you don't, then when you're down at this level, these kinds of things will get you. They'll catch you.
Yeah, well, we're losing that, I think, because
Yeah.
when we had the variant consoles, my students and postdocs, that generation of students and postdocs, knew to open up the cabinets and how
Yeah.
to make measurements and
Yeah.
stuff. Now, if there's something that they don't understand, they call 1-800 Siemens. That's it. And the service guy.
And even that is a part swapping exercise.
Yeah, that's right. Nobody does board level debugging
Right.
or anything.
Right.
Whatever standard tests are on the system, and then they replace a gradient amplifier or an
Yeah.
RF amplifier or a mixer board or something like that.
Yeah.
And the students now have no idea what happens in the black box, or the ivory boxes, at all. And the same is true in our Bruker systems
Yeah.
too now.
Yeah.
They're incredibly reliable, so we don't have to go poking around a lot, but nobody knows how to actually poke.
Which is fine when you're doing routine sort of biomedical research,
Yeah,
right? Cranking it through big big data, that's fine, right? Because you're going to measure myelin ratios or whatever. But if you're going to try and get to this kind of, if you're essentially going to do biophysics in a bio, like you would with an animal in a single electrode, at that level, you kind of need that same depth of knowledge about your system, or you're likely to get some
yeah,
catastrophic weird tail failure.
yeah. And when you're trying to chase down some of those anomalies, there are things you can't do anymore. Like on our Bruker system, you cannot turn off the gradient amplifier. So if you're looking for something that you think comes from the 180 kilohertz switching frequency, you can't turn off the gradient amplifier,
And
because
have
if
the
you do, the
console
system won't run.
Yeah.
And
So
there
there's a
is
safety
no
into
way
it.
to cheat it,
Okay.
right?
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
there's a whole software check
Yeah.
on everything,
Yeah.
and you cannot physically turn the gradient off and make an
That's a
image.
really important point. That's something we should debate. I can drink too, because doing science with the machine not built to do science
Yeah,
is potentially a major limitation that we are conveniently overlooking.
yeah.
Because we like to think of ourselves as scientists, but you're given a tool that is intentionally a black box.
It's intentionally a black box. I think that does the students a disservice. So the next
Yeah.
generation of
Yeah.
students are not going to know how to build MRI machines and look for birdies in a system and things like that.
Although the corollary to that though is there's a whole cottage industry now of people who are building their own low field machines. So people are
Yeah,
getting off the shelf components and cheap
yeah,
and building these. So maybe those are the guys that should be doing these kinds of experiments ultimately. They'll have that board level because they built their own spectrometer. So
yeah. But
maybe
the
there will be
problem
a
the
resurgence.
problem is most of those people, like the Graham Wrights of the world and so on, who've been doing this for ages, are interested only in that low field. So I want to build my own spectrometer, or I want somebody to, which is a Ferrari. You
But why
know,
couldn't? Yeah, okay. But you could. Well, potentially people could do that.
well,
It's not insurmountable, right?
yeah, it's not insurmountable, but building an RF preamp that works at 650 megahertz or 300 megahertz for that matter is way different than 30.
Yeah, for sure.
It's hugely different. You know, the type of transistor you use completely changes. The oscillations change, the impedance matching, everything changes. So just because you built one doesn't mean you could build the other.
That's, I guess, a completely different story, but I think Varian's loss, that's, I think, you know, of all of the events over the last 10 or 15 years in MRI, that was a watershed event. That's such a
watershed event. Even my Brooker colleagues now say, you know, we missed them too, because you know, competition improved the beast. And now there's no competition.
I think it would have helped. I think on the high field side too, obviously Siemens, GE, etc., they all lose too. I think obviously we all lose as a field. Such a shame. Yeah, well, that's we can't end on that note, because that's
as Jeremy Clarkson would have said, on that bombshell.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah, that's terrible. Well, okay. I mean, what else can we finish on? I mean, we could talk all day about this stuff, but I'd be in the whiskey then, and I'm supposed to go for a run tonight.
Yeah, well, you do that. I'm gonna have to make dinner, or hopefully my wife has made dinner, because we'll see. I mean, usually I do my dinners because she's a vegetarian and I'm not. So we'll see. We'll see what's in store.
Yeah, but get another whiskey, you won't care.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, buddy. Well, let me stop this. Hold on.